Hello, my name is Vicente Valentim, and this is the 40-minute presentation video of my book, The Normalization of the Radical Right, a Norms Theory of Political Supply and Demand. The book has recently come out with Oxford University Press as part of the Oxford Studies in Democratization series. And the main argument here is that recent increases in radical right behavior across Western democracies are at least partly brought about by individuals who had radical right views already, but who did not act on them out of fear of social judgment and isolation. And what we have been witnessing in recent years is not necessarily just individuals becoming more radical right, it is also an erosion of the social norms that used to keep radical right individuals from expressing their views. One of the political trends that has been discussed the most in recent years is the rise of radical right parties and politicians. These politicians have won elections in a number of countries worldwide, and in Europe, the continent that I study, by now virtually all countries have at least one radical right party in their parliaments. This is a trend that has been discussed and studied widely in political science, and there are a number of important aspects to discuss related to it. But there is one in particular that I would like to draw your attention to today. And this is how fast the initial support for radical right parties and politicians often grows. As you can see from the plots in this slide, it is often the case that radical right parties go from virtually 0% of the vote to something like 10, 15, or even 20% of the vote in just a couple of elections. And the reason why I want to draw your attention to how fast the initial support for these parties often grows is that I think it is at odds with some of the core assumptions that we tend to make in the political behavior literature. In previous work, there are mainly two explanations for why radical right behavior might be on the rise. On the one hand, there is an economic explanation according to which radical right behavior is a product of structural changes in a country's economy, which makes some of their voters feel left behind. On the other hand, there is also a cultural explanation according to which radical right behavior is a form of backlash against perceived changes in the dominant values in one society. These two explanations differ on a number of points, but I think they have one key commonality, which is that they both think that the key to understanding why someone engages in radical right behavior is in understanding why they develop a radical right attitude or preference, which in the remainder of the talk is what I'll be calling intrinsic motivations. So the idea here is that if one's argument is able to explain why a given voter develops these intrinsic motivations that make them closer to the radical right, then the same argument will be able to explain why, by extension, this voter then carries out to act in radical right ways. And this is an assumption that I think we find not only in the literature on the radical right, but I think it is a broader assumption that we see in the literature on comparative political behavior as a whole. And it really comes down to the idea that preferences and behavior are causally very proximate, and as such, changes in one should be accompanied by changes in the other. And this is the assumption that I try to push back against in this work. I argue that while it is, of course, crucial to understand why someone develops a given intrinsic motivation, a focus on these intrinsic motivations alone is often insufficient to understand a number of important political processes, like the rise in radical right parties and politicians. The reason for this is that we know from previous work that these intrinsic motivations, attitudes, and preferences are fairly stable in the long term. And for this reason, explanations focused on these intrinsic motivations will put emphasis on stability and long-term gradual change, but they will struggle to explain more fast-paced processes like the rise of support for radical right parties and politicians that I was discussing a couple of slides ago. And not only that, but this assumption also ignores some previous theoretical work, which has suggested that, at least in some contexts, preferences and behavior can actually be decoupled. So what I'll be doing here is to build on some of these theoretical arguments, to build a broader theory as to how important changes in political behavior can come about, even if one does not need to assume any change in political preferences whatsoever. I will do so by shifting focus from intrinsic motivations onto extrinsic motivations, and concretely by looking into social norms. We can think of social norms as behavioral rules that individuals follow on condition that sufficiently many others follow them, think they should be followed, and are willing to sanction those who deviate. Now, this idea that deviating from an established social norm can come with costs is crucial here because it suggests that the expected costs of acting on someone's preferences are not fixed. Instead, they depend on the nature of one's preferences and the extent to which they are aligned with established social norms or not. And they also depend on the setting where one is acting and the extent to which others can observe what they are doing. So building on this discussion, I argue in the book that we shouldn't think of the translation of preferences into behavior as something that happens rather automatically, but instead we should think of it as a two-step process. In the first moment, individuals develop a given preference, and then in a second moment, they collect cues from their social environment, which help them decide how socially costly it will be to act on this preference that they have already developed. And if these costs are sufficiently high, they may go through the first step, meaning they may develop a given preference, but not actually act on it in the second step. And in the book, I argue that previous work has spent significant time and effort explaining this first step, which I think is crucial and has provided a much better understanding of how political behavior works, but that has come at the cost of a near neglect of this second step. And this is what I try to do in this work, is to put focus on this second step and to look into, conditional on having developed a given preference, do individuals actually express it behaviorally or not? In so doing, I hope that this work can have two main contributions. The first is a general contribution in highlighting the important role that social norms can have in explaining political change. And the second, more specific contribution is to build on some of the arguments that I'll be making about the role of social norms in political change to explain one specific political process, which is the recent rise in radical right behavior across Western democracies. Starting with the first general goal, in the book, I put forward a norms theory of how a theory of how social norms can affect political supply, demand, and their interactions. And as I said before, the goal here is to explain how important political change can come about, even if we don't need to assume an actual change in the political preferences of individuals. Now, this is not to say, and this is an important caveat, that preferences cannot or do not change. The reason why I'm trying to explain how political change can come about without preference change is that, as I said a while ago, I'm trying to show that social norms are a crucial driver of behavior, and as such, I'm trying to theoretically and empirically hold fixed everything else that could explain political change, including changes in preferences. But of course, one can think that in the real world, both preferences and social norms can be changing at the same time. All I'm trying to argue here is that even if preferences do not change, we can still observe important political change just via a change in the social norms. My argument here starts with assuming that the political behavior of individuals can be broadly categorized as falling into one of two types: private and public behaviors. Private behaviors are those where individuals can discount social costs because those who would potentially sanction deviations from an established social norms cannot observe what one is doing. Public behaviors, on the other hand, are those that at least some potential sanctioners can observe, which means that individuals will take social costs into consideration when they decide whether or not to express their preferences behaviorally. Now, I argue that social norms can affect both the private and public behaviors of individuals as well as the behavior of politicians, but they do so in different ways. First, norms can directly affect the public behavior of voters, and this is something that I have hinted at already. The idea here is that if someone has a given preference that they know is at odds with established social norms, even if they keep that preference in private, they have an incentive not to show it when they are in public to avoid the reputational costs of reaching an established norm. This is something that Timur Grun has called preference falsification. Now, what I also argue here is that one of the consequences of preference falsification at the societal level is that members of that society can underestimate the actual prevalence of the preference that is being falsified. And this affects not only other voters, but it also affects politicians. If politicians who would otherwise be willing to run for politics with a given stigmatized preference do not see many behavioral expressions of that preference, they are likely to think that no one or very few in their society actually hold said preference. And the implication of this is that many politicians will probably think that there's no point running for politics with a platform that represents this stigmatized preference, because if they do so, they have very little chance of actually being electorally successful. The implication then is that as politicians self-select out of running for politics on a stigmatized preference, on a stigmatized platform, this platform will end up with a smaller pool of politicians to pick from when they need to choose a leader. And the implication of this is that on average, stigmatized political platforms, as is the case of the radical right that I'll get to in a second, will have less skilled leaders. And this argument about how political stigma affects the quality of political leaders is key to the argument here, because it explains how norms can then feedback and affect even the electoral decisions of voters. Now, of course, voting is a private behavior as I have defined it, and as such, it should not be directly affected by social norms. But I argue that voting is also a very specific type of private behavior, which can be indirectly affected by social norms via patterns of politicians self-selection. The idea here is that if political stigma prevents individuals from publicly expressing their views and then reduces the quality of leaders of stigmatized political platforms, then even individuals who privately have a political preference that is aligned with that political platform will have an incentive not to vote for it, because they perceive that the leaders of that party are unskilled, unlikely to be electorally successful, to make it to institutions, or even if they do make it to those institutions, they are unlikely to actually push for the implementation of their preferred policies. And this, I argue, this situation that you see in this slide is what happened with the radical right before its electoral breakthrough. Strong social norms inhibited public expressions of radical right views, which meant that even if many individuals had these preferences in private, they would not express them in public. This made politicians underestimate the true prevalence of radical right preferences in their society, making many of them self-select out of running on a radical right platform. As fewer politicians were willing to do so, it was harder for radical right parties to find a skilled leader, leaving them with politicians who were unable to mobilize even voters who actually did have a radical right preference in private to go out and vote for them. As they were unable to do so, the radical right fared worse electorally, which further reinforced perceptions that radical right views were stigmatized and marginalized in society. This is a stable and self-reinforcing equilibrium, which I call the latency phase. Now, for this for this equilibrium to be overcome, I argue that societies need to go through a three-step process of normalization. First, they need to move from latency to what I call the activation phase, where an exogenous trigger makes some individuals who had radical right views already feel comfortable expressing said views in public for a short period in time. Now, this wouldn't be sufficient to, on its own, overcome this political stigma, but it is sufficient to make skilled political entrepreneurs realize that there's probably more private support for radical right views in their society than typically meets the eye. In so realizing, they have an incentive to run for politics and collect the support of these voters whose views are not being represented in the political debate. And if they do so and are successfully electorally while doing it, societies can be tipped over to the last phase in the process of normalization, which is what I call the surfacing phase. In this phase, the very fact that these skilled radical right entrepreneurs have electoral success ends up eroding the norm that used to exist against the expression of radical right views. Radical right voters realize that there's many others like them in their society, which make them feel more comfortable acting on their views. And politicians, on the other hand, also update their priors as to the probability that someone will be successful while running for politics on a radical right platform. They realize that one can be successful while running on one such platform, which makes them more likely to join a party of this ideology. So in the remainder of the presentation, I'll provide you with some pieces of evidence about each of the three phases. Of course, I cannot cover the full extent of the evidence presented in the book, but I will give you a sense of how I test each of these phases. Before I do so, however, I want to spend 30 seconds discussing how I measure political stigma and perceptions of social acceptability in the real world. Of course, the difficulty with testing this argument empirically is that it rests on concepts like preference falsification, which are very hard to measure empirically, because by definition, preference falsification means that someone holds a given preference that they are not willing to reveal to others. And so one of the ways that I try to go around this issue is by putting forward a measure of social acceptability called reported vote. And the rationale here is that, as I have been arguing, voting is a private behavior, and as such, it should not be directly affected by social norms. But admitting what one has voted for is likely to be affected by social norms because it is a social interaction. And if you think, for example, of the setting of a survey interview, we know from previous work that individuals often feel judged by the interviewer and try to provide whatever they think is a socially desirable answer. So building on this reasoning, what I do here is to compare the official vote share for a given party against the vote share for that same party as declared in post-electoral surveys. Post-electoral surveys are surveys that in the aftermath of an election have interviewers ask respondents who did they vote for in the election that just took place. And to collect comparative evidence on this type of surveys, I draw upon the comparative study of electoral systems, which puts together post-electoral surveys across different countries and across a fairly wide time span. So just to be concrete, what I'll be doing here is to calculate reported vote by dividing the vote share for a given party in the comparative study of electoral systems by the vote share for that same party. If this measure is 1, it means that the vote share for the party, the official vote share for that party, is virtually the same as the vote share for that same party as reported in post-electoral surveys. If the measure is below 1, however, that will mean that the vote share, the declared vote share for a given party in post-electoral surveys is lower than the official vote share for the same party, which would suggest that some individuals who are voting for that party are not admitting to having done so, which I would take as evidence that there is a social norm against supporting said party. So building on this reasoning, I will now move on to the analysis, and I will start with the latency phase. This is the first phase in the process of normalization, and one of the key aspects about this phase is this argument that because there is a political stigma against the radical right, many individuals who have radical right views in private often do not show them in public. To provide some evidence of this implication of the argument, I have built a data set where I have taken each party included in the comparative study of electoral systems, and I have hand-coded the official vote share for that party. I end up with a data set of over 1,300 parties in 51 countries over a time span of 24 years. But what is important to note here is that for each of these parties, I know their official vote share, I know the share of individuals who say they voted for that same party, and I can thus compare these two measures. Now, of course, what I'll be trying to show here is that incentives to preference falsification exist, but only for voters of the radical right. And to do that, I also need to code parties according to their ideology. I will not get into this in much detail now in the interest of time, but I code the ideology of the parties according to secondary sources. And in so doing, I code whether parties are radical right, radical left, center left, or center right. And for each of these party ideologies, what I'll be doing in the next slide is to compare the average official vote share for parties of one of these ideologies against the declared vote share for those same parties in post-electoral surveys. And that is what you see in this plot. As you see, the plot has 4 facets. One for each of the party ideologies that I was discussing in the previous slide. And within each facet, you see two bars. The solid line bar represents the official vote share for parties of that ideology. And the dotted line bar represents the declared vote share for the same parties as reported in the post-electoral surveys included in the comparative study of electoral systems. And if you look into this right-hand facet, which refers to the radical right, you will see that when it comes to parties of this ideology, the declared vote share is consistently lower than their official vote share. To make this more concrete, on average, the vote share for radical right parties in my sample is close to 8%, but on average, only 6.5% of respondents admit having voted for one radical right party. This is a reduction of around 20%, which I think is fairly substantial. What I also want you to note is that the same pattern is not found when you look into parties of other ideologies. This pattern only happens when it comes to the radical right, which I interpret as being because there is typically a social norm against expressing radical right views, which means that even individuals who are willing to vote for one of these parties in private will often not admit having done so when they are having a social interaction with someone else. Now, the fact that this type of reference falsification is going on suggests that there are some political preferences in society that are being unmobilized by politicians. And realizing this will, as I have argued, generate incentives to political entrepreneurship. There is a voluminous literature on this idea of political entrepreneurship, where one of the key arguments is that political newcomers have an incentive to find this type of unmobilized preferences in their society as a way of breaking through electorally. And not only can this help their short-term success, it can also help them in the long term by helping them get ownership over the topic that they have been the entrepreneur of. So the idea here is that if and when politicians realize that there are more radical right preferences in their society than typically meets the eye, they will have an incentive to act as these political entrepreneurs who are the first to put them in the political debates. And one of the ways that I discuss this type of political entrepreneurship in the book is by looking into the German case. As you may know, the first radical right party to be successful in Germany was the AfD in 2017, but there had been radical right parties in the country already. However, their leaders they lacked political skill, and as such, even individuals who had radical right views in private often did not go out and vote for them. And indeed, as I show in the book, in this phase, even individuals who were willing to admit being radical right did not vote for one of the previously existing radical right parties at higher rates than did individuals of other ideologies. And not only that, I also show evidence that the leaders of these previously existing radical right parties were low skilled by standard measures of politician skill, and they remain peripheral in the German political landscape. Now, this situation is in stark contrast with what happens with the political entrepreneurs that will eventually join the AfD. These entrepreneurs who are triggered by the outgroup threat of the 2015-16 refugee crisis were highly skilled by any metric. They were highly educated, if you believe that is a proxy for politician skill. If you are skeptical of that proxy, I also show evidence that they had experience in previously existing mainstream parties that had been successful, and that many of them had held key economic positions before joining the AfD, as is the case of Alice Weidel, for example, who had worked for Allianz and Goldman Sachs before she joined the party. Now, their entrepreneurship consisted of taking the AfD, which existed already, but not as a radical right party, and placing it clearly at the radical right end of the ideological spectrum. And as they did so, they openly acknowledged that there was a social norm in Germany against expressing radical right views, but they also openly breached that norm, and they argued for the need to get rid of it. And in so doing, they were able to mobilize these individuals who were radical right, but who were previously not voting for the already existing radical right parties in Germany. And indeed, I show in the book that these individuals who are willing to admit being radical right, but who were previously not voting for the already existing radical rights parties at higher rates, now become significantly more likely to support the AfD. Now, the argument of the book is that once these political entrepreneurs enter the political system with a radical right platform, if and when they become successful, it is their very success that ends up eroding the norm in a stable way. This success has two main implications, one at the voter level and one at the politician level. As I said, at the voter level, individuals who were radical right already feel more comfortable publicly showing their views. And at the politician level, politicians realize that actually one can be successful while running for politics on a radical right platform, which means that more politicians should join one party of this ideology. So in the remainder of the presentation, I'll provide you with some pieces of evidence about these two implications of the argument about the surfacing phase. Starting with the voter level, one of the pieces of evidence that I show is that the share of the official vote for a given party that is reported in post-electoral surveys, which I was talking about in the latency phase, is significantly higher if radical right parties are in parliament than if they are not. If you look into the left-hand facet of this plot, which refers to radical right parties, you will see that when these parties are not in parliament, reported vote for them is around 0.6, which means that for each 10 individuals that vote for a radical right party, around 6 are willing to say that they did so. However, once radical right parties are in parliament, this figure is much higher. In this case, reported vote is as high as 0.9, which means that for each 10 individuals that vote for a radical right party, 9 are now willing to admit having voted for one of these parties. So this is a substantial increase, and it is, again, one that is specific to the radical right. If you look into center-right parties, for example, as a term of comparison, which you can see in the right-hand side facet, you will see that the same increase does not happen once center-right parties move from not being in parliament to being in parliament. Regardless of whether they are represented in institutions or not, center-right parties have a reported vote that is very similar and is always very close to 1, which means that they are typically not underreported in post-electoral surveys, regardless of whether they are in parliament or not. So what this suggests is that this preference falsification that typically existed, where individuals who were willing to vote for radical right parties would often not admit having done so, is significantly reduced once these parties enter parliament. So once these parties are represented in institutions, individuals who were radical right already feel significantly more comfortable publicly expressing their views. Of course, this is purely descriptive evidence, but in the book, I also show some causal estimates from a regression discontinuity design that takes legally fixed thresholds to parliamentary representation as a cutoff point. And there, the estimates are very similar. I find that for each 10 individuals that voted for a radical right party, 4 more are willing to tell the interviewer that they did so if parties narrowly cross the threshold than if they narrowly failed to cross that threshold. Now, finally, I also want to show you some evidence about the surfacing phase at the politician level. As I have been arguing here, in previous stages of the process of normalization, the same norms that made individuals often falsify their preferences and not show their radical right views also made politicians underestimate the electoral prospects of joining a radical right party. This is why there were less politicians willing to run for politics with one such ideology, leaving parties of that ideology with less skilled politicians. But now that these political entrepreneurs have been successful with a radical right platform, these politicians are likely to update their priors and realize that actually one can be successful running for politics even if they have a radical rights platform. And so to show you some evidence of this point, I draw on secondary data on MP switching parties, which was collected by Elisa Volpi. She has collected this data for 13 European countries in the post-war period. And in her data set, each row is one individual MP switching from party A to party B. But I have grouped this data at the party and legislative period, which means that in my data set, each row is a given party over a given legislature. And for each of these parties over that legislative period, I know the number of MPs who moved from a different party to that one and who moved from that party to a different one. And then I calculate the difference between these two types of movements, which will be my outcome variable in the analysis that I'm about to show you. So basically, if this variable is positive, it means that more MPs joined a given party than left it. And if it is negative, it means that more MPs left a given party than those who joined it. As I said, this will be the dependent variable in the analysis that I'm about to show you. And as independent variables, I have coded the vote share for each party. I have included a dummy for whether they are radical right or not. And I also include the interaction of these two variables. Now, the interaction is what I'm substantively interested in here, because the idea is that whatever effect electoral growth has on MPs switching parties, which I have no expectation about, this effect should be higher in the case of radical right parties, because these are the parties whose electoral prospects were previously being underestimated due to social norms. And as you can see from the table in this slide, as you would expect, the interaction is positive and significant, which means that as radical right parties grow, more MPs are willing to join those parties than those who are willing to join parties that are not radical right, but that are growing at similar rates. So again, this supports the argument about this surfacing phase now at the politician level. So to conclude, I have been arguing that recent increases in radical right behavior across Western democracies are at least partly driven by individuals who had these views already, but who did not act on them out of fear of social judgment and isolation. Now, the same social norms that silence public expressions of radical right support also made politicians underestimate how prevalent radical right views were in their society. But if politicians do realize that these preferences are more widespread than is typically observable, they have an incentive to run for politics on a radical right platform and mobilize these preferences that exist in their society, but that are not being met by political supply. And then, if and when they become electorally successful, their very electoral success updates the perceptions of voters and politicians and makes radical right individuals who were previously engaging in preference falsification more comfortable publicly expressing their views. And it also makes politicians update their priors as to the likelihood of electoral success when one runs for politics on a radical right platform, meaning that more politicians are now willing to join a radical right party. Now, I think these findings have a number of important implications that I would like to briefly discuss before I finish. In the first place, they suggest that while democracies do generate social norms against behavior deemed at odds with core democratic values, many individuals who follow these norms actually keep counternormative preferences in private. And because they keep these preferences in private and simply engage in preference falsification, all it takes is an information shock, which makes them realize that their views are more widespread than previously thought, to make them feel more comfortable showing their true colors. And note that this behavioral change can happen very fast because it doesn't require that individuals actually change their views, which would be a more long-term process. All it requires is that they feel more comfortable publicly acting on what they already thought in private. I think that these findings also have implications for this common assumption in the comparative political behavior literature that I was talking about in the beginning, where it is often assumed that preferences translate into behavior rather automatically. Instead, the two-step process of translation of preferences into behavior that I try to push for in this book argues that first individuals develop a given preference, but then they will survey their social environment, trying to figure out how socially costly it will be to act on those preferences. And if these costs are sufficiently high, they may develop a given preference, but not actually translate it into behavior. And as I said in the beginning, I think that previous work has spent significant time and effort looking into the first step, which has provided a number of important insights into how political behavior works, but that has come at the cost of a near neglect of this second step. And this book has the ambition of opening a research agenda surrounded on the second step by showing that it exists, is consequential, and should probably be paid more attention to in future work. Thank you very much.